who we are. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit, independent research organization, 501c3. We focus on a variety of public policy and economic issues that relate to the equitable and sustainable economic health of the Commonwealth. So that means we do a lot of work on budget and tax, but we also do a lot of work on municipal finance, education finance, public higher ed, transportation, childcare, you name it. And what we always want to be is a resource for policymakers, our members, and the public. And we also want to try to make sure we're shaping the public policy agenda. And so thanks again for joining. And then the last thing I want to say is, so this is something new we're trying. We did one yesterday with Ashley White, who's an MTF researcher, today with Megan, where we take a kind of a detailed look at some specific topics in the budget. We're really excited to do these and to open these up, not just to MTF members, but to a wider audience. And we want to keep doing them. But in order to do that, we need some support as well. And so would ask that for any folks who are interested in whether it's sponsorship or research contributions to offset for some of the work that, as I think you'll see, a fair amount of work goes into this. It's something that we absolutely want to create some new partnerships and work with new folks to make sure we can continue to provide things like this, which we think will help advance the conversation in a number of ways. So again, thank you. And with that, I'll go on mute and turn it over to Megan. Thanks, Megan.
Great. Thanks, Doug. So good morning, everyone. Just to reiterate, Doug, thanks for joining us this morning. I'm going to share my screen. I have quite a bit of information, as Doug said, to share with you all this morning. So I am sharing my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Awesome. All right. So we heard from Doug in terms of an introduction of MTF. And then the information that we're hoping to cover with you all this morning. We're going to kick off by providing a fiscal background. We'll talk about revenue collections to date in fiscal year 2023 and what that means looking ahead to fiscal year 2024. And then we're going to spend some time talking about statewide resources and spending themes in Governor Healey's budget before getting into the specific investments that she makes in municipalities, K-12 education, and higher education. I have a few slides after that do a deep dive into Student Opportunity Act implementation before we wrap up with a big picture look at the budget process and what we can expect coming next. So in terms of fiscal background, this first slide really distills the 5 main things that we think you need to know heading into fiscal year 2024 based on current revenue collection trends. So number 1, tax revenue growth is flat halfway through the fiscal year. Through February in 2022, we had seen pretty skyrocketing revenue collection trends. So revenues were trending 21.2% higher than they had been the year before. In fiscal year 2023, we're seeing flat revenue growth. So revenue collections through February are level with where they were last year. But while revenue collections are flat, because budget writers took a pretty conservative approach to setting tax revenue benchmarks in fiscal year 2023, collections are still running about $1 billion ahead of benchmark. A slight caveat to that surplus, however, is that there does continue to be pretty significant downside risk in what are called non-withholding collections. And non-withholding collections are those revenues that are typically the most volatile. So they include things like estimated payments or capital gains collections. The other 2 things that we think are really helpful for you to know heading into fiscal year 2024 is that the income surtax is now in effect, but the fiscal year 23 impact is expected to be pretty limited. And then tax relief is going to loom large over the legislative session. And we're going to get into Governor Healey's specific tax relief proposal later on in the presentation. This slide is really intended to provide some additional context for those revenue trends that I just discussed, and in particular, that skyrocketing revenue that we saw over the last 2 years. So between fiscal year 2010 and fiscal year 2020, state tax revenues grew by $11 billion. And between 2020 and 2022, revenues grew by $11.5 billion. So the state basically collected a decade's worth of tax revenue growth in just 2 years. And so this is just really helpful to keep in mind when we're talking about flat tax revenue collections in fiscal year 2020, or even modest growth in fiscal year 2024. We're talking about those trends on top of a much higher base of tax collections than the state had even seen just 2 years ago. And so I think a question that a lot of people have after looking at that last slide is, okay, we see this massive jump in tax revenue collections over the last 2 years, But is that just kind of the result of pandemic recovery? And can we now expect revenues to return to those pre-pandemic trends? And when we look into the numbers, I think the answer that we find to that question is really no. And that regardless of the pandemic, revenue collections are still far greater than what we otherwise would have expected them to be coming out of the pandemic. And so this chart is looking at projected tax revenue growth between 2019 and 2024 had the pandemic not occurred. And that's represented by this yellow line. So prior to the pandemic, state tax revenue collections were growing at an average annual rate of about 5.1%. The blue bars in this chart are showing actual revenue collections between 2019 and 2022, and then projected tax revenues in 23 and 24. So you can see that even with projected revenues in 23 and 24, they're far outpacing pre-pandemic revenue trends. So both of those slides, I think, are helpful to keep in mind as we look now at the fiscal year 2024 consensus tax revenue agreement. So this agreement at the end of January came out between administration and House and Senate budget leaders. And the agreement really included two things. One, it included a modest increase to the fiscal year 23 revenue benchmark of about $151 million. And then it included less than 2% revenue growth on top of that for fiscal year 2024. For a total consensus revenue figure of $40.4 billion. And this consensus tax revenue agreement really serves as the revenue foundation for the governor's budget, which we saw in Governor Healey's proposal, and then it'll serve as the foundation for the House and Senate proposals as well. But again, I think the main takeaway here is that heading into fiscal year 2024, the state is in a very strong fiscal position, and this modest revenue growth of 1.6% in fiscal year 2024 is again being built on top of that much higher tax revenue base as a result of the last 2 years. So the consensus tax revenue agreement also included a couple provisions related to the new income surtax. So first, it agreed to no use of surtax revenue in fiscal year 2023, and surtax revenues are not included in that $40.4 billion consensus tax revenue figure. Instead of incorporating surtax revenues into the consensus tax revenue estimate, administration and legislative budget leaders instead established this $1 billion cap on the use of income surtax revenues in fiscal year 2024. And this was consistent with one of the recommendations that MTF provided during the consensus tax revenue hearing. This is my last slide by way of providing some fiscal background. It really aims to provide some more details on the additional resources that budget writers have available heading into fiscal year 2024. So over the last 2 years, the state has really made significant progress in building up its reserve accounts. So since fiscal year 2020, the state's rainy day fund has grown by $3.6 billion. And we've also seen about $1.7 billion in state surplus funds still available. In addition to that, we have about $1 billion in specific reserves dedicated towards Student Opportunity Act implementation, as well as early education and care. So this is just in addition to the state tax revenues that we're seeing, in addition to the new income surtax funding, we also have this cachet of resources available still in reserves and available to budget writers heading into fiscal year 2024. So now to take a look at the statewide resources and spending themes in Governor Healey's budget. On the day that the governor's budget was released, MTF put out a really comprehensive report over 30 pages, including all of the resources that it utilizes, its spending themes, and its outside section policy proposals. But if we were to condense that report down into its main takeaways, we come up with this kind of top 5 list. So number 1, Governor Healey's budget reflects a nearly $1 billion tax reform package that she proposed in companion legislation. And that package has a net cost to the fiscal year 2024 budget of about $742 million. And I'm going to get into the difference between those two numbers in a couple of slides. Governor Healey's budget also includes major increases in funding for childcare, education, and transportation. And her budget creates a mechanism to collect, track, and manage the volatility of surtax revenues. Workforce stands out as a major funding priority for Governor Healey in fiscal year 2024. especially with the launch of the new Mass Reconnect program, which aims to connect adults aged 25 and up with cost-free community college. And then lastly, spending for Mass Health is anticipated to drop significantly in fiscal year 2024. And that's a reflection of both the end of the federal public health emergency as well as its related policies. And of course, spending for Mass Health, not directly related to investments in municipalities or schools, but it does traditionally take up the largest share of the state's budget. And so really important to pay attention to what's happening there because it can have an impact on the resources available for other areas of the budget. This slide has a lot of numbers on it, so I won't spend time going through all of them. The same tables are included in that report that MTF published online that I just mentioned. So we welcome everyone to dive in and take a deeper look. But the main takeaway here is that Governor Healey proposes a balanced budget. It includes about $62.5 billion in total spending, supported by $62.7 billion in total state revenues. This next slide provides some additional details on that tax relief proposal that she filed alongside her budget, in which I mentioned is $1 billion annualized cost. But if effective for the 2023 tax year, Governor Healey's tax proposal is expected to have a fiscal impact of about $859 million. And the difference between that figure and the $1 billion figure I just mentioned is related to her proposal on the estate tax. So Governor Healey is proposing an effective increase to the estate tax from $1 million to $3 million. And the annualized cost of that proposal is estimated to be about $275 million. But its first year of implementation, the cost is expected to be much less at $167 million. So that's the difference that's really driving that $1 billion figure and this $859 million. The net cost of Governor Healey's budget proposal to fiscal year 2024 budget is only expected to be $742 million. And the difference between that figure and the $859 is related to her proposal on short-term capital gains. So on short-term capital gains, Governor Healey is proposing a reduction in the tax rate from 12% to 5%. And that is estimated to cost about $117 million. But its net cost to budget is only expected to be $1 And that's because in Massachusetts, capital gains collections above a certain threshold are automatically deposited into the stabilization fund and other reserves. And so when we reduce the tax rate on short-term capital gains, we're not reducing the amount of funding that's available in support of the state budget, but we're reducing the amount of revenue that's deposited into these stabilization fund and other reserves. So that covers Governor Healey's tax proposals on both the estate tax and short-term capital gains. She has three other major tax relief proposals reflected in her budget. So first, on the child independent tax credit, she's recommending an increase to that credit to $600 per dependent, and then the removal of the cap on the number of dependents. Currently in Massachusetts, the current credit ranges from $180 to $240 per eligible dependent, and there's a maximum of 2 dependents per family. Governor Healey is also recommending an increase in the state's rental deduction from $3,000 to $4,000, and then a doubling of the senior circuit breaker tax credit from $1,200 to $2,400. So those are her 5 major tax relief proposals. We have the child independent tax credit, the estate tax, short-term capital gains, the senior circuit breaker tax credit. And then Governor Healey also recommends 10 smaller changes to the state's tax code that have a combined fiscal impact in 2024 of $16.5 million. And the most notable of those changes is an increase to the state tax credit cap for the Housing Development Incentive Program known as HDIP. And Governor Healey is recommending an increase in that state tax credit cap from $10 million to $50 million in fiscal year 2024. So that covers Governor Healey's tax reform initiatives. Her budget, as I already mentioned, also utilizes $1 billion in new revenue from the income surtax to support investments in both education and transportation, as that revenue is constitutionally obligated towards. So MTF had recommended to budget writers a 50-50 split in how to allocate income surtax funding towards education and transportation investments. And Governor Healey basically meets that goal. So 59% of income surtax revenues go toward education and 49% go towards transportation. And then the funding is also split between both recurring operating investments as well as one-time investments. And whether an investment is recurring or one-time in nature is specifically noted within the line item language for these different programs. So about 60% of the funding goes towards one-time investments. Within the education bucket specifically, we see the largest amount of income surtax revenue going towards higher education. So $360 million dedicated towards investments in higher education. We see $140 million going towards early education, and then $10 million dedicated to K-12 education. And just a note on that $10 million, while it is kind of the smallest piece of this pie, as we're dividing up income surtax revenues, it's important to note that Governor Healey's budget still includes really historic levels of investment for K-12 education, most notably, which we're going to get into in much more details, fully funding the third year of implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. And then Governor Healey is also proposing a funding structure to transparently collect, track, and report on income surtax revenues through the creation of the new Education and Transportation Trust Fund. And so her budget creates this 3-year temporary funding structure for the fund and sets a goal of establishing a more permanent funding structure for income surtax revenues by fiscal year 2026. So in fiscal year 2023, all revenue collected via the income surtax will be deposited into the Education and Transportation Fund. In fiscal year 2024, like I said, there's that $1 billion spending cap, and collections above $1 billion will be available for one-time or capital expenditures. In fiscal year 2025, that $1 billion spending cap is increased by 3% to $1.03 billion. And again, collections above that cap will be made available for one-time or capital expenses. And then in 2025, a minimum balance requirement is set for the fund. And so the balance of the fund moving forward has to remain at 1/3 of that spending cap. And that's really to ensure that enough resources remain to support those recurring investments while we continue to refine income surtax revenue projections. A couple other things not mentioned on this slide. Number one, DOR will make quarterly estimated payments. The Department of Revenue will make quarterly estimated payments into the Education and Transportation Trust Fund. And then the balance of the fund will be certified annually by the Comptroller's Office, I believe no later than December 15th. So that was our last slide on looking at statewide resources and revenues reflected in Governor Healey's budget. And this slide looks at high-level spending themes in her budget. So this chart is comparing spending in Governor Healey's budget to last year's budget, both including income surtax spending and excluding income surtax spending. So the yellow bars represent Governor Healey's budget inclusive of the income surtax, and the blue bars represent spending excluding the income surtax revenue. So a couple things to note. Excluding income surtax spending, line item investments increased by 3.6% over fiscal year 2023. And that's pretty consistent with the trends that we've seen in recent years. You can really see the impact of surtax spending in two categories, as you would expect, local aid and education, as well as transportation. And then in the two categories where it looks like spending has been cut in Governor Healey's budget compared to fiscal year 2023, it's important to be mindful that this is often not the full picture of the available funding available for these areas. And in particular on workforce, there was about $100 million in federal funding made available for workforce programs through both ARPA as well as economic development legislation that was passed last year. And that funding continues to be made available. And so I think this reduction in funding that we see reflected in Governor Healey's budget is more an acknowledgement of these additional resources that continue to remain available for workforce programs. And then similarly on transportation, the fiscal year 2023 budget, so last year's budget, included a new multi-year $266 million reserve account intended to address key workforce and safety initiatives at the MBTA. And that funding continues to be made available to help address those initiatives. And so while it looks like a cut, again, it's really an acknowledgement of this additional funding that remains available to the MBTA, kind of outside of the 24 budget proposal. All right, so now we're able to move on to the specific investments that Governor Healey includes in municipalities. And first up, we have unrestricted general government aid, or more commonly referred to as UGA. And in her first budget, Governor Healey proposes $1.25 billion for UGA. That's a $25 million or 2% increase over fiscal year 2023. UGA funding has been decoupled from the consensus revenue growth estimate of 1.6%. I'm going to talk about what that means in much more detail on the next slide. But then since fiscal year 2021, UGA funding has grown by $127.6 million. So some pretty substantial increases. But to talk a little bit more about decoupling UGA funding from that consensus tax revenue growth percentage, for way of background, during the Baker administration, funding for UGA had been consistently increased by the same percentage rate as the consensus revenue estimate. And so if the consensus revenue growth estimate was 3%, municipalities could understand their UGA appropriation to also increase by 3%. And the purpose of this policy was really to help improve the predictability of state aid. But what we started to see in more recent years was that actual state tax revenue collections began to substantially outpace the consensus tax revenue estimates. And as a result, we're growing at a far greater rate than by which UGA funding was being increased. And I think we've heard different calls from municipalities to look for ways to maybe more equitably share some of that tax revenue growth with cities and towns across the state. But what this chart is really trying to illustrate is that divergence between growth in UGA funding and growth in state tax revenues. So the blue line shows actual UGA funding, and the yellow line is demonstrating how UGA funding would have increased if it were increased by the same percentage as actual tax revenue growth. And so you can see between 2014 and 2020, really those two things remained in line with one another. And it's not until we get to 2021 and 2022, when we've seen these massive surges in state tax revenue collections, that those two things really start to diverge. So again, Governor Healey's budget does not follow the Baker administration's proposal of tying UGA funding to the consensus tax revenue growth estimate. But I think monitoring actual tax revenue trends and trends in UGA funding is something we'll continue to keep an eye on. In terms of pilot payment in lieu of taxes for state-owned land, Governor Healey funds that program at $51.5 million. That's a $6.5 million or 14% increase over fiscal year 2023. It's our understanding that this funding level reflects both the most up-to-date property valuations and also aims to provide municipalities with at least the same pilot payments as last year or higher payments. A new program for municipalities that Governor Healey funds in her budget using $100 million in surtax revenue is this new MassDOT Municipal Partnership Grant Program. And we're continuing to learn more about this program. We don't have a ton of details yet, but it's our understanding that this program was really created in response to some calls from municipalities for additional support with design and development of transportation-related projects. Those costs are often, or those aspects of projects are often more cost-effective at economies of scale. And so these grants could help municipalities do things like access additional funding opportunities or begin construction on some of these really critical projects. Other municipal investments that we think are worth noting, Governor Healey includes $20.5 million in a municipal regionalization and efficiencies reserve, and all of that funding is earmarked for specific programs. So we see $8 million for Community Compact, $5 million for public safety and emergency safety grants, $2 million for regional planning agencies, and then a total of $2.5 million for other municipal grant and fellowship opportunities. In terms of aid for libraries, across all of these programs, we see an increase compared to last year's budget of $4.5 million, and that's reflected in this $17.9 million for local aid for libraries, $15.9 million for regional library aid, and then $6.2 million for library technology and resource sharing. And then lastly, the Shannon Community Safety Grant Program is level funded with last year's budget at $12.3 million. So that covers kind of the main investments that we see in Governor Healey's budget for municipalities. And now we're going to turn to K-12 education. And we're going to start off by talking about Chapter 70. So Governor Healey funds Chapter 70 in fiscal year 2024 at $6.6 billion. And that's nearly $600 million increase over last year's budget, a nearly 10% increase. In terms of what this means for Student Opportunity Act implementation, we see fiscal year 2024 as representing its third year. So we're about halfway through that 6-year implementation schedule. And the state remains on pace for full funding by fiscal year 2027. Low-income enrollment in fiscal year 2024 is once again counted up to that 185% federal poverty level threshold. And that new threshold has resulted in an additional 69,000 students being captured under this new low-income measure. Some other notable elements of Governor Healey's Chapter 70 proposal, we see inflation within the foundation budget formula statutorily capped again at 4.5%. For the first time in about 4 years, we see statewide foundation enrollment increase by just under 1,500 students. That's the first time, like I said, in 4 years that we've seen an increase coming off some pretty drastic declines during the pandemic. And then between fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024, the statewide foundation budget grows by over $1 billion. This next slide I have helps to visualize that increase in the statewide foundation budget. And so you can see between 23 and fiscal year 2024, that over $1 billion increase. But important to note that since fiscal year 2021, so since the beginning of implementation of the Student Opportunity Act, the statewide foundation budget has grown by $2.3 billion. And that's a cost, of course, that's met with both increased Chapter 70 aid as well as increased required local contributions on the part of municipalities. To put that year-over-year increase of $600 million into context being proposed by Governor Healey's budget, this chart looks back over the prior decade of Chapter 70 aid increases. So between fiscal year 2014 and fiscal year 2022, we saw Chapter 70 state aid for public schools increasing by around $100, maybe $250 million a year. But that obviously changes when we get to fiscal year 2023 and the Student Opportunity Act begins to be implemented in earnest. Last year, we saw a $500 million increase in Chapter 70 aid, and this year just under $600 million. So this really makes a difference for districts across the state. And in particular, some of those highest needs districts across the state are seeing really large year-over-year increases in their Chapter 70 aid amounts. This table just offers another look at Student Opportunity Act implementation. And so you can see that for the foundation budget rates within the Chapter 70 aid formula that are impacted by the Student Opportunity Act, we're moving from 1/6 to 2/6 to now 3/6 implementation towards the full goal foundation budget rates as outlined in the Student Opportunity Act. Low-income enrollment, like I mentioned, is based on that new higher 185% federal poverty level threshold. That's resulting in many more students being captured as low income, and that's resulting in increased aid being delivered to districts as well. And then in terms of minimum per pupil aid, Governor Healey is proposing a $30 per pupil. That's a decrease compared to last year's budget, which included $60 per pupil in minimum aid. But we saw that increase to $60 per pupil come from the legislature during last year's budget process. And so I think minimum aid is another thing that we can keep our eye on throughout the budget development process to see if the legislature once again makes any changes there. Moving on to some other notable K-12 education programs. The Special Education Circuit Breaker program is funded in Governor Healey's budget at $504 million. That's a $63 million increase over last year. And it's our understanding that that funding level both meets the statutorily required 75% reimbursement rate for instructional costs within the Special Education Circuit Breaker program, but also fully funds out-of-district transportation claims at 100%, as called for within the Student Opportunity Act. Charter tuition reimbursement is level funded with last year's budget at $244 million, but still we understand that to meet that 100% reimbursement requirement also outlined in the Student Opportunity Act. Governor Healey's budget includes some pretty substantial increases for the student transportation reimbursement accounts, funding each program at least at a 90% reimbursement rate for districts. So for regional school transportation, we see that account funded at $97 million. For non-resident vocational student transportation, we see a really big increase in funding here to $5.2 million. Just a note, in last year's budget and in the year before, this program was funded at $250,000, and that was resulting in only a 6% reimbursement rate for districts for this program. So with this increase to $5.2 million in Governor Healey's budget, to reach that 90% reimbursement rate is a really big increase in funding for the program. And then homeless student transportation is funded at $28.7 million, providing a full funding, full reimbursement for those costs, similarly to last year's budget. And then just another note on special education costs, because we know that these are really critical to municipalities and school districts in particular this year. But as a reminder, the Special Education Circuit Breaker program reimburses districts for eligible special education costs that are incurred during the prior fiscal year. So in fiscal year 2024, the Special Education Circuit Breaker program is reimbursing districts for the special education costs incurred in fiscal year 2023. We've certainly heard from municipalities that in fiscal year 2024, they are expecting to face some pretty substantial increases to their special education costs related to some inflation and workforce-related cost increases at private special education schools. Now, most of those increased costs will be available for reimbursement through the Circuit Breaker program in fiscal year 2025. But to help some districts cope with those increased costs this year, Governor Healey does propose a $20 million investment for what are called extraordinary relief payments. And those are within the Circuit Breaker program. They have historically been funded at around $5 million, but these payments are intended to provide additional aid to school districts facing increased special education costs in the current fiscal year. So that's one way that Governor Healey's budget is attempting to address some of these increased costs that municipalities and districts are facing. In terms of rural school aid, Governor Healey funds this account at $7.5 million. That's a $2 million increase over last year's budget. And fiscal year 2024 is the first chance that policymakers have to act on some of the recommendations that we saw coming from the Rural School Districts Commission, which was created in the Student Opportunity Act and released its final report last July. One of its recommendations was increasing funds for rural school aid. And so we see Governor Healey making progress on that recommendation. I think we'll have to wait and see, we'll have to wait for some more details to see how that funding will exactly be distributed to districts and how many districts may benefit, but it's certainly an increase in funding over last year. A couple other notable education programs before moving on to higher education investments. Governor Healey's budget does not include funding for the Universal School Meals pilot program. So this was a program that had been funded at $110 million in last year's budget. And the intention was to extend the program through the entirety of this school year. I think we recently learned that that $110 million won't quite make it. And so Governor Healey has proposed in a supplemental budget, and this was also included by the House and in its version of the supplemental budget, a $65 million appropriation to ensure that that program remains fully funded through the current school year. And then alongside her budget, Governor Healey had included some supplemental materials, and in them she indicated her intent to seek additional funding to continue universal school meals through fiscal year 2024. And so that's just something that we'll have to keep an eye on any upcoming supplemental budgets to see exactly how much funding is dedicated to extend that program for another year. The summer learning program is funded at $3 million in Governor Healey's budget. That's a $2 million increase over last year. And then social emotional learning grants are level funded at $6 million in the governor's budget. And she maintains a $1 million earmark to fund a pilot program to provide 30 school districts across the state with access to universal mental health screenings. I think we see in other areas of the governor's budget that we're not touching on in this presentation, a real focus on mental and behavioral health investments. And I think this investment for mental health screenings in public schools is really a continuation of that focus. So moving on now to the investments that Governor Healey includes in higher education. So as I spoke about at the beginning of the presentation, Governor Healey dedicates more than a third of the available income surtax revenues towards new and existing higher education programs. And I'm going to speak about those specific investments on the next slide. But first, I just wanted to talk about what funding for higher education looks like without taking into consideration surtax spending. So excluding surtax spending, Governor Healey funds the higher education sector at a total of $1.6 billion. That's an $11 million increase over last year's budget. Among community colleges, state universities, and the University of Massachusetts, we see them funded at a combined total of $1.4 billion, a $36 million increase over last year. And we understand those funding levels to provide campuses with at least a 3% increase in their appropriations. A note about this $27 million decrease in funding that you see under this other higher education spending category, that's related to the backing out of funding for a program known as the Higher Education Endowment Incentive Program. So that program was funded at $20 million in last year's budget. Historically, that's a program that's been funded through supplemental state budgets with the use of surplus state resources. So it's not necessarily abnormal to see that excluded from the governor's budget. It hadn't in more recent years been included in the state's operating budget. So to dive deeper into the surtax spending that goes in support of higher education, like I mentioned, a total of $360 million, bringing total higher education funding to $1.9 billion. That $360 million investment is divided amongst both operating investments as well as one-time investments. So of the $220 million in income surtax spending that we see dedicated towards ongoing higher education expenses, we see $93 million for financial aid expansion. I'm going to talk about that in more detail in the next slide. We see $59 million for a new higher education fee stabilization account, $30 million for student support services, $20 million for Governor Healey's new Mass Reconnect program, which I'll talk about in a couple slides as well. And then a total of $18 million for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives at both UMass and state universities. The $140 million she includes for one-time investments is really intended to address the backlog of deferred maintenance projects across public higher education campuses. So to provide a little bit more background on that $93 million financial aid expansion program, this slide looks specifically at the accounts within Governor Healey's budget that fund scholarship programs. So in total, we see an investment of just under $300 million for scholarship programs, including that $93 million expansion. And that $93 million is really intended to support an expansion of what's known as the Mass Grant Plus Scholarship Program, which specifically goes to support students attending public higher education institutions. That's different than this kind of standard Mass Grant program, which is also available to students attending private higher education institutions. But outside of that expansion, we see the state's main scholarship reserve level funded at $175 million. Within that reserve is where you'd see funding for programs like that standard Mass Grant scholarship. Foster care financial aid and foster care and adopted fee waivers. These are also level funded with last year's budget that provides additional financial relief to students involved in the foster care system, attending college or university. And then we see an increase of $4 million for the Community College Success Grants Program. There was just an article in the Boston Globe a couple of days ago about the early success of this program for students attending community college. And I think this $4 million increase for the program is really in recognition of some of that early success. This slide takes another look at the specific investments that Governor Healey makes in college and career readiness programs. And the two programs highlighted in yellow at the top are those that are supported by surtax revenue. So we see Governor Healey providing a total $35 million increase in funding for college and career pathways programs across her budget. And that includes the $10 million in surtax spending going towards early college and innovation pathways, as well as $20 million for that new Mass Reconnect program, which is Governor Healey's attempt at providing cost-free community college for adults age 25 and older. Another note about early college and innovation pathways programs funding. These programs receive funding through a couple different sources in the state budget. So you see this $10 million supported by income surtax revenue. They have a total of $18 million through their standalone line items in the budget. And then there's also language in that main scholarship reserve that I talked about on the last slide that allows some of that funding to go in support of early college programs. And so I think the diversity of funding streams that these programs are receiving in Governor Healey's budget is also speaking to the success that they've seen in their early years of implementation and as they're really starting to expand across the state. Just a note on the investments that Governor Healey includes for private higher education in her budget. Of course, there are no direct investments for private higher education institutions, but there are a number of programs in the budget that provide grant funding as well as scholarship support for private campuses and students attending them. So like I said, we have that standard Mass Grant Scholarship Program. Early college funding does go to support some partnerships between private institutions of higher ed and public high schools. And then students involved in the foster care system attending private higher education institutions are eligible to receive some financial aid through that foster care financial aid program. All right, I know I'm moving pretty quickly. There's a lot of information to get through, but we're nearly there and then happy to answer any questions. But like I said, just wanted to circle back and offer a deep dive into the Student Opportunity Act implementation, because this is one of the largest investments that Governor Healey makes in her budget, and it really has an impact on districts and municipalities across the state. This is the same table that I showed you earlier, so I won't spend time going through it again, but halfway through Student Opportunity Act implementation. And over those first 3 years of Student Opportunity Act implementation, we've seen the foundation budget grow by $2.3 billion. And that's resulted in a $1.3 billion increase to Chapter 70 aid and an $861 million increase in required local contributions on the part of cities and towns across the state. Now, notably, 57% of that $1.3 billion increase in Chapter 70 aid has gone to just 23 districts across the state. And these are the highest needs districts in Massachusetts, most of them in low-income groups 11 and 12. But the distribution of aid in that way has largely been purposeful. And that's because the foundation budget rate increases included in the Student Opportunity Act were targeted towards those lowest income and highest needs districts. And then on top of that, we have this updated definition of low income that has increased low income enrollment, like I've said, by over 69,000 students. And those 69,000 students are also going to be located in those highest need, lowest income districts. And so that's what's resulting in all of this aid really being targeted in such a specific way. But it kind of goes without saying then that increases in state aid versus required local contributions have been uneven across the state. The next couple of graphs that I'm going to show you really help to illustrate that point. So this chart is looking at percent of foundation budget growth across low-income districts, as well as percent of state aid growth across low-income districts. So we'll just look at state aid for right now, and that's represented by the blue bars. So for low-income groups 1 through 9, we see those districts increases in Chapter 70 state aid, representing less than 5% of the overall increase that we've seen in Chapter 70 state aid, that $1.3 billion increase. That's obviously very different in low-income groups 10, 11, and 12, where the majority of that aid is being directed. Those districts are representing 20, more than 30, and 25% of the total increase in Chapter 70 state aid that we've seen over the first 3 years of Student Opportunity Act implementation. This next chart is a similar view, but it's comparing both Chapter 78 increases over the first 3 years of Student Opportunity Act implementation to required local contribution increases over the first 3 years of SOA implementation. And it's looking again across low-income groups. So you can see for low-income groups 1 through 8, the majority of their increased education costs, and those increased education costs are the combined total of Chapter 78 and required local contribution. But for low-income groups 1 through 8, the majority of those increased education costs are being covered by increases to required local contributions on the part of municipalities. Comparing that to low-income groups 9 through 12, the majority of their increased education costs are being covered by new state aid. And so we just start to see that divergence in how these new costs related to the Student Opportunity Act are being covered in different types of districts across the state. I mentioned that both the Charter Tuition Reimbursement Program as well as the Special Education Circuit Breaker Program were both impacted by the Student Opportunity Act, and the fiscal year 24 budget as proposed by Governor Healey meets both of the funding schedules that had been outlined in the Student Opportunity Act, fully funding circuit breaker out-of-district transportation claims and fully funding charter tuition reimbursement. This chart takes a look at statewide foundation enrollment. I mentioned that increase of about 1,500 students between fiscal year 2023 and fiscal year 2024. But I think it's really helpful to just put that number in context, especially when you see that large loss of students in fiscal year 2022 related to the pandemic, a loss of over 30,000 students. And so while we're beginning to see a more positive trend in student enrollment, we still have a long way to go in order to make up all of the students that were lost over the past few years. This chart is another look at enrollment that I think we find interesting. It looks at student enrollment changes across grade level. The yellow bars are looking at enrollment changes across grade level over the last 4 years, and the dark blue bars are just looking at enrollment changes across grade level from last year to this year. So you can see that over the last 4 years, the largest number of students was lost in the elementary school grade levels. Some loss of students in junior and middle school grades, and then additional loss of students in the high school grades. When we look at the blue bars to see how those trends have shifted in the last year, we start to see a slight rebound of 2,700 more students now enrolled in elementary school grades. We continue to see some loss in junior and middle school grades, and then we're seeing slight increases in things like high school as well as vocational school enrollment. And then this is my last slide, and then happy to open it up to questions. I know, like I said, a ton of information we're providing you with this morning, but just really important to keep in mind as we think about these increases in Chapter 78 that districts have received, especially over the last 3 years, is that districts continue to have a pretty substantial amount of federal resources that have been made available to them through the federal ESSER program. So this is looking at the 3 buckets of ESSER funding. All of the funding that had been awarded to districts through ESSER 1 has been claimed by districts. There's about $260 million in ESSER 2 funding that remains unclaimed. And there's $1.3 billion in ESSER 3 funding that remains unclaimed. So in total, we've seen districts claim about $1 billion in ESSER funding that's been awarded to them. And there's still about $1.5 billion in ESSER funding remained unclaimed. And so again, just important to keep in mind that as some of the districts that have experienced the largest increases in Chapter 78 over the last 3 years are also the districts that received the largest amount of ESSER funding. And so balancing out the spending down of both these federal funds and their Chapter 78 funds will just be a challenge for districts in the coming year and something that we're going to want to keep an eye on. All right, big picture and what's next. I'm going to skip ahead to the budget timeline. So the next step in the budget process will be the Joint Ways and Means hearings. Those just kicked off yesterday, and they're going to continue to take place throughout March, and we'll focus on specific areas of the governor's budget. But after that, we'll expect the House Ways and Means Committee to release its budget proposal in early April, and then we'll be looking towards the Senate Ways and Means budget in early May. So we have a lot still to look forward to in the budget development process, and the governor's budget is really representing just the beginning. All right, thank you all very much for your patience as we went through all of that information. I'm happy to stop now and take any questions that people might have.
Megan, just one question from the chat we got about the possibility of extending the ESSER timeline and what? Sorry, hold on. Or the criteria for ESSER spending. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So the ESSER timeline in terms of how long districts have to spend down that funding will be ultimately determined by the federal government. I think the state can certainly take steps to help districts better manage the expenditure of those funds. We saw some proposals last year from the Baker administration as well as the Senate to help districts meet both their net school spending requirements and use these federal resources. We haven't seen a similar proposal come out yet this session, but I think that's something that we'll want to keep in mind. But ultimately, that's a decision that will be made by the federal government.
And then Megan, do you want to talk a little bit about when you look at the Student Opportunity Act and the cap on inflation this year and last year, what's the differential in those 2 years between, I know you talked about this a little bit, between the capped inflation and the actual inflation?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So inflation statutorily capped at 4.5%. That is set within Massachusetts general law. That was the case last year as well, even though actual inflation in fiscal year 2023 was trending closer to 6%. It was about 5.9%. In fiscal year 2024, actual inflation is trending towards 9.2%, so substantially higher than last year. And that's why we're seeing that statutory cap at 4.5% again.
And then we just got a question in the chat about as you look at the governor's budget, what are the areas that are most likely to kind of remain the same in the House and Senate, and then what areas are most likely to be different? I know you talked about that a little bit, but maybe start by talking about UGA and Chapter 70 as kind of the big ticket items, and then maybe talk about the use of surtax dollars.
Sure. So I think time will tell to see how the legislature approaches that. Historically, we've seen pretty consistent funding in the governor's budget and in the legislature's budget proposals for programs like UGA. Last year, we did see the Senate increase funding for UGA to a 5.4% increase over the prior year. And now that it has, at least in the governor's budget, been decoupled from the consensus tax revenue estimate, the legislature certainly has an ability to put their own mark on that. In Chapter 70 funding, I think you can expect to see the legislature also seeking to meet that third year implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. But within Chapter 70, I know I mentioned there are certain aspects like minimum per pupil aid that we've seen the legislature adjust as they take up their budget proposals. And then if I think we see a change in Chapter 78, it would probably be in an area like minimum aid per pupil.
And one thing I would just add to that, Megan, is I think the area where you could see the biggest differences are that use of surtax dollars, right? That's kind of an area of first impression for the governor, right? It's the first bill that's putting forward a plan on how to use those funds. And one of the challenges we've seen with the COVID recovery bills that have happened over the last 2 years is when people aren't starting from like a shared spending framework of what you need to spend the money on, you end up with very different proposals from the governor, House, and Senate. And then synthesizing those into one at the end of the day creates some real challenges, especially when folks are dealing with a spending cap as we are this year. So if I were to note, as Megan indicated, I'll Chapter 70, you could see changes around the margins, but nothing probably too drastic. But the proposal of how to use that surtax revenue, whether it's that transportation education split or how to use that, that's something that I would say is absolutely not written in stone. And you could see some really significant changes in the House and the Senate. And then there was a question in the chat, Megan, about the school, why school lunches in the SUP as a supplemental budget as opposed to the GAA. If you want to, get inside the governor's mind for a second.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd have to do some proselytizing. I'm not entirely sure why the decision was made to include that in a potential upcoming supplemental vehicle versus the operating budget. My guess is that because this is a pandemic recovery program, continuing to fund it through a supplemental budget offers just a little bit more flexibility than pulling that into the state's operating budget. That would be my best guess, but we'll have to see what's proposed in any upcoming supplemental budget.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, there was a story in the Globe last week, and obviously at the local level, folks are tracking it, but for a number of programs, as you're dealing with federal support that is turning off, I think it's a real challenge that I know we're struggling with as well. Which of those programs you continue and which you don't? And I don't know this, but I can imagine that the decision to move the school lunch for universal school meals program into a SUP was kind of a half step, right? Not fully committing to kind of including this now in the operating budget, that this is something we're going to do necessarily permanently, although obviously there's flexibility there. My gut is the message was, yes, we're going to keep this going for a while, but we've yet to make a final decision on kind of how we're going to approach that going forward, but we'll see. And yes, we'll send out copies of the slides, and I, Megan, I'll let you get the final word, but I just want to say what a phenomenal job, Megan, on the presentation. And great turnout for everyone. Thank you. And again, we'll send out a survey with the slides and look forward to continuing the conversation with folks. We want to keep doing these and we'd love to figure out a way to do that. But Megan, I'll let you wrap it up.
Awesome. Thank you, Doug. I'll just repeat your thanks. We're really appreciative to have so many people log on and to hear us walk through some of the specific investments that Governor Healey makes for municipalities and education. And like Doug said, we're looking forward to doing these throughout the rest of the budget process. And we hope you all can join us for those presentations as well.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll send this stuff out shortly.
Doug, before we break, can we address the special education costs and the 14% tuition increases for private school tuitions for special education?
Sure. How do you address it? Just talk about what it is and its impact, I guess.
What is the state's, what is the governor's position on that? And are there indications of increasing the circuit breaker reimbursement to adjust for those costs, as they've had a $100 million impact on school districts across the Commonwealth, but there's only $20 million earmarked to address that problem? That still gives us an $80 million gap. And I'm just hoping you could address that.
Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So I was just going to say that obviously we can't speak to the governor's position on the 14% rate increase, but in terms of what she includes in her budget proposal, it is that increase to the extraordinary relief payments to $20 million. Those had historically been funded at only $5 million within the circuit breaker program. We'll see if any additional funding. I think Governor Healey just yesterday during the Joint Ways and Means hearing mentioned looking at an additional upcoming supplemental budget to maybe address some of these costs for districts related to special education. But in terms of what's in her budget, we see that $20 million for the extraordinary relief payments.
All right, excellent. And appreciate the final question, Kirk. So thanks, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you all soon.